Hello.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon. It's Skylar. How you doing?
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
What's up, Simon?
Hello.
How you doing?
Hey.
Hello.
Hey,
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Simon.
This is Conversations with Storytellers, a podcast of wisdom and thoughts, folk and fairy tales from our elders, and I am your host, Simon Brooks. A meeting with professional storytellers. I decided to travel around the country, when I could, to do interviews with some of the elders in the community of traditional storytelling, people who, for their work, travel around telling myths and legends, folk and fairy tales. Each storyteller shares their thoughts on our profession and gems and wisdoms, and sometimes a story or two. I'm glad you're here. Alton Chung is a very funny guy. He's a scientist, a computer guy, theatre tech, but really, he's a storyteller. We've only met once or twice, and I've always enjoyed his company. Alton is a Japanese-Korean storyteller who grew up with stories, superstitions, and the magic of the Hawaiian Islands. Our conversation led us through the history of Asian-Americans in Hawaii and World War II, ghost stories, and later in part 2 on finding stories, his process, and healing. Please enjoy part 1 of this conversation with Alton Chung. So, Alton, thank you very much indeed for joining me for Conversations with Storytellers. It's been a little while since I've done one of these, and I'm very excited that you've joined me.
Oh, so thank you so much for inviting me.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. How are you doing?
Oh, it's not too bad. Winter's Christmas holidays coming up. This is going to be fun.
Are you a big Christmas holiday fan, or?
I am. It's just one of those things that I kind of look forward to. I don't know why. I just do.
So this is a question. Do you hang stockings up?
No, we don't hang stockings up, and it's I usually go home and spend Christmas with my dad, and but I like that cool Christmas in the air and the just the whole ambiance of the thing. I don't know. It just makes me happy.
Yeah, it's a nice time of the year. Now, Alton, you live between Hawaii and Portland, Oregon, right?
Well, yeah, I live in Vancouver, Washington, right across the river from Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay,
and my dad is elderly, and so my brother and I trade off taking care of him. He can't live by himself anymore. Mm-hmm. And although during the pandemic, it was like no one knew what was going on, so I spent 18 months there. And wow. So this is like the first time. Yeah, and so this is like the first time I've actually, one of the first times I've actually been back in my own home, so it's kind of nice to be in my own space and look at all the maintenance jobs that I haven't I need to get done.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because I'm looking outside and we got snow here, and I know that Vancouver gets snow as well, and I'm glad that your pipes didn't freeze and like you come back to a waterlogged house.
Oh yeah, no, I've got very good neighbors who check on my place, and I'm very appreciative of them.
Well, that's great. That's great. So one of the first questions that I usually ask people is, what was it like growing up as little Alton? What was life like for you as a child growing up, and what influenced you in so far as story goes?
Oh, as far as story goes, well, at a very young age, my mother really pushed me to read, and that is, is a gift. It opened up so many doors for me, and I'm so appreciative of that. So I was always going to the library, I was reading all kinds of things, and I never thought of myself as ever being a storyteller. I always wanted to be a scientist, and so I'd read all kinds of different things, lots of science. And for a while, I was into whales, dinosaurs, whales, horses, and allowing me to read, learning how to read at an early age, and being a voracious reader, I was able to explore on my own whatever I wanted to look at. We didn't have the, internet wasn't, far away at that time. Yeah, right. But so, my world was going to the library and opening up books and things like that. And, looking through the encyclopedia, I didn't, a lot of times I didn't even understand what they were talking about, but I love looking at all the pictures.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you and I are of a similar generation, if not the same one. And the illustrations in a lot of the encyclopedias, I mean, at least the ones that I were looking at, there were obviously the kids ones, which had lots of pictures in, but there were also the not quite kids, not quite grown-ups, but it had these line drawings in. And I always loved those line drawings. Was that the same for you, or was...
Oh, I love the pen and ink drawings, and I you know, the photographs of, I remember, you know, looking, here's a photograph, you know, it's a black and white photograph of an aardvark. I said, what's an aardvark? Oh my God, there's something like that actually lives like that? Wow. You know, and the encyclopedia, like yeah, well, I don't know that. There was no smellogram in the encyclopedia. You know, it was an old set. I don't know how we got it. It's like, I remember it was like 1954 set. So we got it from somebody. And, you know, just after World War II, that era. And so they had lots of photographs and you know, graphics about, you know, World War II. And, you know, as a kid, just fascinated by the technology and just the sheer scope of things. I didn't really understand what people were fighting for. But, you know, at the time, you know, there were lots of war movies on television and looking at all these pictures of what it was like, you know, trying to imagine what it was like. And then, you know, when you go to look at the body, all these transparent overlays of the body. Here's your intestine system. Here's your liver. And I'm like, wow, what is all this stuff? It's colorful and it's cool. That's inside of me. Ew, gross. Okay, next. But that just allowed me to go and, you know, just explore and have fun. And you know, and as far as stories go, my mom would tell me stories, I guess, that she, as a child, knew. Like, you know, lots of Japanese folk tales, like Momotaro, the Peach Boy, and Isonboshi, Little One Inch. And she would either... people gave me, or I ended up having my own little library of books and folktales. And lots of times, you know, I knew the stories, but lots of times I just look at the pictures and just kind of imagine and start telling the story to myself. I don't know what I was talking about. They say that this is what I used to do, and I used to look at the pictures and start talking about describing what's in the picture and what was going on, making things up as I went along. No clue. I have no real memory of that, but they have photographs of me doing it.
Well, photographs can't talk, so but yes. So all right. So you said that World War II World War II wasn't going on when you were alive, was it?
Oh no. I was years later, but
okay.
It was you know, I grew up in Hawaii, and as a child, I'd hear these stories, and my parents would look upon, you know, certain men. They said, "Oh, that he's in the 442," you know, and they speak of them in awe, and I just really learned, okay, you know, people respect these people, whatever they did. I don't know, and it wasn't until years later, actually, when I really became. I mean, I knew kind of sort of the story of the 100th Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all Japanese-American combat units. But I really didn't know their story until, you know, I became a storyteller. And one day I just got a wild hair and I said, oh, I want to tell, you know, I knew that these men were getting older and a lot of them were passing away. I said, oh, I you know, as a storyteller, I can tell stories. I want to tell the story of the 442nd. And I remember calling up my uncle, you know, a close friend of the family. And I said, you know, I'm a storyteller now, and I want to tell the story. And I knew you were a sergeant in E Company. I want to interview you. And he said, oh, no. It's been 60 years. I'm still trying to forget. I went, oh, okay. Backed away. You know, and I kind of, you know, continued to do my own research and things like that. And I don't know, I just had this compulsion. I was just driven to go and try to understand what these guys went through and to tell their story. And I was invited to tell my version of the 442nd story at the 65th reunion of the 442nd. Hilton Hawaiian Coral Ballroom.
You created a whole show for that, right?
I created one piece, and that piece was so successful that I created an entire show around that thing. But at the time, I only had this one story, and you know, I was 1,200 people. You know, big screen television in the corners. People from the Pentagon on the lead table. Danny Noy, the senator, was there. And I'm about ready to go on. And this close friend of the family, my uncle, comes up and he says, oh, yeah, Hill 140. I was on Hill 140, and I looked at him and said, Hill 140, that was in Italy. That's where Ted Tenoy won the Medal of Honor. I said, yeah, I was there. But you see, this one leg is all shorter than the other. I got hit in the ankle. I got evac'd out. I missed all that Lost Battalion stuff. And then he went away and talked to all his friends. And his wife comes up to me. My aunt says, I've been married to that man for 55 years. This is the first I've heard of any of this stuff. So that's how closely held these stories are.
Right. So let's backpedal a bit, because I know that
Sure.
So I was going to bring this up later on. I was going to, work through.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is all good. So the 420 seconds.
440 second.
440 seconds. Sorry.
Yes.
Was a regiment that was created, as I understand it, was created by the people from Hawaii, because they there was another regiment that came before them, right? And also young people from, or maybe not young people, but people from the Japanese internment camps, right?
Okay, first of all, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, all the Japanese-Americans, many of them who were in the military, all of a sudden became suspect. And a lot of them were rounded up, their weapons taken away, and they didn't know what to do with these guys. So some of them put them in the stockade, some of them put them on work details. And then the government decided to go and create a separate unit, the 100th Battalion separate, which was, it's I guess discriminatory unit. They put all the same guys in the same unit and leave them alone. And they sent them off to boot camp. And these guys did so well in training that they realized that, hey, this is something special. Because a lot of these guys, they knew that they had to be superlative soldiers to be considered average. They just wanted to be accepted. Right. But they did so well that the government realized, at the time, early in the war, America was losing the war. And they realized they needed as many fighting men as possible. So they formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was they wanted to have like 2,400 people, I believe, 1,200 from Hawaii and 1,200 from the internment camps, to form this unit. Almost 10,000 guys from Hawaii volunteered for this unit. And, they were trained. And in the meantime, the 100th Battalion was shipped off to go and fight in Europe. They didn't allow them to fight in the Pacific because they couldn't tell who was the enemy and who was not. And a lot of times they didn't trust them too, so they had to go and prove themselves. And so these guys, 100th Battalion got sent to Italy, and they did amazing things. In the Battle of Belvedere, they won a presidential unit citation. That's like everyone in the entire unit getting the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal you can get for valor in combat, just under the Medal of Honor. And then in the meantime, the 442nd was being trained in Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and they were shipped to Italy. And the 100th Battalion was joined to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but they were able to keep their own single unit designation because they were so amazing. I mean, they were known as the Purple Heart Battalion because so many guys got wounded. Some guys got as many as 4. Maybe even more. Purple Hearts being separate wounded incidents, and they go to the hospital to get treated, and they go back to the unit. They couldn't get shipped home, but they went back to their unit because it was all about the guy, being part of that unit, taking care of their friends and things like that. And so over the course of the war, this became, for its size and the duration of service, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Almost like 18,000 awards. Total of maybe, I think, 7 presidential unit citations, 21 medals of honor. Just the list, it goes on forever. It's just an amazing, amazing thing that these guys were able to accomplish. And because of that, they won respect. And like I said, growing up, all the people understood what these men had sacrificed, what they went through, and they were really revered, at least in Hawaii, where I grew up, anyway.
Right. That's amazing. So you grew up around some of these people, presumably?
Yeah, but these a lot of these guys were what they call Nisei, second generation Japanese-Americans.
Right.
So their parents were the immigrants, and they were the first generation born in the United States. And they're a lot of they were taught, and as I was taught, that if it's something is really good, if you've done something really good, you don't have to say anything. That's called bragging. But everyone, if it's really good, everyone should know, and that's enough. And so these guys a lot of guys are really reticent to say anything. And also, we didn't know that PTSD, they call it shell shock. I mean, there's a lot of suffering that went on that people just didn't know. They, just had to suck it up. And so a lot of these stories were held closely because, like a lot of the Vietnam vets, you weren't there. I can't tell you. You wouldn't understand. And so, and now, a lot of them are going already. But when they were in the 80s and 90s, they realized that, hey, no one's going to be able to know or tell our story. And they began opening up a little bit more.
And that's when you started to collect the stories?
Yeah, I mean, luckily there were enough documentation. There's an organization in Seattle called Densho, which Tommy Ketta runs that. And they specifically went after and interviewed a lot of these veterans and people who went through that part in World War II, and they indexed and categorized and put all those interviews online. And I was able to go and comb through that and search for specific types of information or specific words and things like that, and the interviews would come up. Again, many books have been written about this, personal recollections, historical things, and I was able to really dig into to get a lot of these firsthand accounts, which is different than, like, say, the Filipino veterans of World War II, which actually relatively little is written about. And, these guys were really discriminated against and were denied a lot of the benefits and things that were promised by the U.S. government to this day. Wow.
There's so much that we don't know about these little nooks and crannies of history.
Well, it's like the not too nice things about, what happened during the war. Yeah. And, what I've learned is, any kind of historical document, things like, who writes the histories?
Right, yeah.
The people who want.
Absolutely.
And, no one wants to go and, look at all the not so nice things that they did. They want to look at the glorious things and, but
yes, and
I find it fascinating digging through some of these things and realizing, what actually happened and what has changed, and showing respect, I guess, more than anything else to what these people have experienced. And I worry, like I said, for the veterans coming through from Iraq and Afghanistan. My goodness, what's going to happen to them, and hopefully they were able to go and avail themselves of services and counseling and things like that were not available to these veterans from Vietnam, Korea, World War II.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things that has helped, I think, is, it's not shell shock anymore. It's PTSD or whatever, I don't always get it mixed up, but, it's a very real thing. And it's, people know about it now and they can help treat it, which is, I think, fascinating and brilliant as well, because, people need that help, especially, they don't get paid a ton of money to go and risk their lives, and when they come back, you need to look after these people. That's how I think of it anyway. So,
and I agree.
So one of the things that you talked about just now is that a lot of veterans hold these stories close to themselves because they don't want to relive it. It's totally triggering for them, and it's really hard to process all that stuff. Especially a lot of these people, they were out there in their younger years, right? And so there's that element to it as well. There's with age comes wisdom, and we can realize, oh, that's what's doing this to me, right? Whereas when you're young, it's like, why am I thinking like this? Why are these things happening, right? And you don't have that wisdom to deal with it. But also, from the stories that I've read about, China as well as Japan, is that you're talking about the honor of people, right? these people are very, very much revered and honored, but there's that other side of honor as well, where the soldiers, the characters in a lot of the folk and fairy tales that I've read, they're very honorable people, right? And they don't brag, as you said. And do you think that adds to the closeness of which these people held, that these men and women who fought held these stories to them? Do you think that's part of it as well? There's like some cultural.
I think it's part of it. There's a story that I received from a man by the name of Goro Arakawa. He passed away. But his family ran the Arakawa General Store in Waipahu, Hawaii for many, many years, plantation general store. And he was well versed in the history of Waipahu and the people there. And he said that, a lot of these boys who went to fight with the 442nd, 18, 20-year-olds, they have no clue. In situations, they have no concept of what's going on or anything to really compare to. And he said that, they knew they had to do very well, and they had no guideposts. But a lot of them went to Japanese school, Japanese language school, which is like an after-school program, and that one of the classes they had was called essentially ethics, in which they read Japanese folk tales and stories of heroes and things like that. And they patterned.
They read folk and fairy tales.
Yeah, because it shows, how to behave. Yeah. And the moral dilemmas and exemplary honor, essentially. And so these boys who are, out fighting in Europe, they've never been out of the country. And here they are in these situations they have no concept of. They fell back upon what they learned in that class. How they patterned their behavior after the heroes and the folk tales that they knew that they held up, and this is an example of how you need to behave, and that's how they conducted themselves. And so I look upon that and say, yeah, there's a definite connection as far as the stories that you hear growing up, how you're being held up as to behave in a society or to be honorable. And when you have no other guideposts, when you're in situations that you have no context, what do you fall back upon? You fall back upon what you know, and what you know is what you've been taught of how to behave. And right. And I believe that these men did that and conducted themselves to the best of their ability in the most honorable way they could.
Well, yeah. I find that absolutely fascinating that's, that ethics class was, that's one thing that I think is missing from a lot of schools. Yeah. Let me rephrase that. I think ethics is something that should be brought into schools all over the world, really, because I think that's a huge part of what's missing. If we look at what's going on in the world around us, if we were taught ethics, I think we'd be
even just other ways of looking at things, right. Other perspectives. I remember when I was in grad school, there was a class, and it was, I think it was a required class, and it was when I was working on my MBA, and the professor brought in all kinds of different things. He had us read, Wiesenthal's, Man's Search for Quest for Knowledge, for Existence, or something like that. I forget exactly, but he brought in poetry. He brought in things that, you can ethical dilemmas and how to make decisions. And I remember one of these classic things: the center cannot hold. All things go to chaos. And they said, what does this mean to you people? And how does this apply to a business situation, or just another way of looking at things, and realizing that it's not just dollars and cents. That these are people's lives you're playing with here. And that, what is your responsibility as a person, as, a business leader or a manager or whatever it happens to be. But what is your obligation as a member of society to look at things in another perspective that way, to take that in consideration, as well as the dollars and cents and things like that. And what is a good business decision, but what is a good decision for society in general and you as a person individually. So that perspective, I think, is important.
I totally agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. I think it's really important to do that. But you don't just have an MBA, do you? You have a degree in zoology. You have a BS in zoology, and you also have a master's in oceanography. Am I right?
Yes.
So,
I was a scientist for 8 years.
So you're a scientist for 8 years, and then you ended up doing what after that?
Oh, I kind of wandered around. No, I also wanted to be a scientist, and I was able to be an oceanographer. I went out to sea a lot. I was a seagoing computer technician. I did my research off the off the coast of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and on salmon. And, I was seagoing tech for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, for the National Marine Fisheries Service. I went off to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, just, running net systems and just being a regular deckhand and having a great time. But, I was living grant to grant. And I realized, I need to get something more stable. I had a choice. I could either go on to get a PhD and write my own grants or do something else. And I really didn't like reading research papers. I thought they were very, a lot of them were pretty dry. And I wanted stories. And also, my major professor had 25 years in the business, international reputation. He wasn't getting any grant money. And I said, God, I could spend another 5 to 7 years working on a PhD and then do what? So I decided, I tried all kinds of things. I trained as a massage therapist and realized that, male masseuses were not, and this is like in the 80s, the male masseuses are not really welcomed. I said, okay, enough of that. What else can I do? And then I went back and got an MBA.
That's so cool.
I needed a job, a real job.
A real job, as they say, as non-artist people say. Why don't you have a real job? It's a real job, storytelling. So when you were doing your oceanography work, and you've still got this story, I'm assuming that you still have this storytelling thing going on in your head and in your soul. Were you aware of some of the ocean stories, or all of or not all of them, obviously, but like a great many of them, or not so much?
I was always interested in what this thing was on the beach or in the ocean, and why was it there, and what was it doing, and how was it making its living? Those are the things that I was just intrigued with. And, when the fish species would come up on deck, I'd be running around being so excited, looking at its colors, taking pictures and things like that, because I was just thrilled with that. I had no clue, absolutely none, about storytelling or what that really meant. I just knew that this is the aspects of my work that I really enjoyed. I loved history, learning about, what has happened before and why things are the way they are. That's fascinating to me. No, I really didn't think anything about becoming a storyteller until, I was working for Hewlett Packard and realized, what else can I do? I worked as a technical director for startup theater companies. I did lighting design. I learned how to do lighting design in theaters for a community theater. And I did that for many, many years. And like I said, was a technical director for a couple of startup theater companies. And I was still looking around for things to go and do. And that's when, storytelling happened.
So how old were you when you were doing the lighting stuff?
In my 30s. I mean, I was working a full-time job and I was bored and I wanted to do something else. And my office mate said, "Oh, well, she turned out to be the president of the local community theater company." And I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting." And they said, "Yeah, we're looking for technical people." I said, "That sounds interesting." And so off I went. And I was hooked for that. That was a great time. And I, being, the person in black, hiding in the shadows and, doing the lighting and watching all these people on stage do their thing and watching the audience, react to that. That was just so much fun.
That must have informed you somewhat, like watching from behind and seeing what people do and seeing the good reactions and the bad reactions.
Yeah, it really did.
Storytelling to some degree.
I understand lighting. Find your light, be well lit. But also, I can see, I watch these people, my friends, the actors and actresses on stage with a facial expression, with a gesture, with a movement, look at that. Look what you're communicating with that. Not only delivering the line and interacting with other people on stage, but, what you're saying volumes by not saying anything at all and just simply, arching an eyebrow or, staring off at someplace else or with your body language. So yeah, these are things that I learned and I profited by that. But again, I had no clue what to do with any of this knowledge. I just thought it was interesting. And it wasn't until when I became a storyteller, I realized that everything I had been doing my entire life had, given me the tools that I could use to do this. I mean, I knew about computers and I knew how to write from writing scientific papers and things like that. I knew about how to do research. I learned about how to be on stage. I learned about lighting and, the nonverbal things that you do on stage. Certainly the delivering of the lines. And so, how to run a small business, all these things that I picked up along the way, has allowed me to go in and play now.
Yeah. But that's amazing that your life really did provide all these tools for you. It was like, but with you, it was like you were picking up these skill sets and these tools that you could use for storytelling. And then when did you come upon storytelling? What was that moment when you were like, this is storytelling, I want to do this?
I took a class. I mean, there's an independent bookstore in a little tiny town in Oregon where I was living, and I knew the owner, and I was, hanging out in his store and looking at his newsletter. I said, "What's this storytelling class?" He said, "Oh, interesting story behind that ad." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I found it posted. This Post-it had all this information on it." And I said, "Oh, well, it's a person who wants to teach a class. I'll put it in my newsletter." He publishes his newsletter. He gets a phone call from the lady. He says, "I guess I'm teaching a class." He goes, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I gave you that Post-it a year ago." This Post-it had wandered around his desk for about a year, and he finally put it in his newsletter. And I said, "This is too weird." Exactly it. "This is too weird. I got to take this class." I didn't know what it is. I just take it because I was bored. And, we did theater games for the first meeting. And she said, "All right, everyone go home, prepare a story, come back and tell it." And I'd just been to South Africa. I'd visited some of my old professors who were on sabbatical there, had a book of South African folktales. And so I just picked one. And I, memorized it and came to class and told it. And this lady kind of looks at me and says, "Okay, what are you going to do with this talent?" I looked at her and said, "Nothing. I got a job. I don't care." And she was the head of the local storytelling guild. And she kept after me and after me. She would tell stories. I said, "Okay, fine, I'll tell stories for you." So I told stories with the guild and for the guild for about a year and a half, and I put it aside because I got busy doing other things. And then 2003, I've moved up to, near Portland, Oregon now. And I joined the local storytelling guild here. And everyone keeps telling me, "Oh, you're a storyteller, you're a storyteller." I said, "Fine." There's a thing called a showcase down in, Salem. It happens every 2 years. You have 5 minutes on stage. The whole audience of librarians from Washington, Oregon. I said, "Great, I have one 5-minute story." So I said, "All right, get up on stage, tell my 5-minute story, get off stage." Said, "Okay, that was a good experience." I started getting phone calls from these librarians saying, "Come to my library, tell stories for an hour, we'll pay you." And I said, "Pay? Money? Really?" And that was the beginning. I mean, it was a year of living dangerously because I had no idea what I was doing. But luckily, like I said, I found mentors in the storytelling community. I was really embraced by this community. And it's been an amazing journey ever since. And like I said, that's been almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah, that's really cool. So who were your mentors?
Actually, I guess, there's the president at the time, and he kind of encouraged me. And there are some other tellers in the guild who also encouraged me. So, you're really good once you come tell stories with us, etc. I ran into, I was being invited to little tiny festivals. And this one teller said, "Oh, you should go to the National Storytelling Festival and see what, storytelling is really like." And I said, "What's that?" And, I said, "Oh, well," the teller said, "Okay, I got space, we were renting a house. We got space. Once you come out." I said, "All right," dropped everything, bought a last minute ticket, off I went. And I was amazed. It was like, my God, this is storytelling. This is amazing. I was just enthralled. And I remember walking down the street in Jonesboro, Tennessee. Never been to Tennessee before. I'm just walking down the street, and all of a sudden, this Asian lady and this black guy stopped me and said, "Oh, are you a storyteller?" And I look at them and say, "Yeah, brand new storyteller." That was Motoko and Eshu Bumpus. And they said, "Oh," they start talking to me. And I realized, yeah, I'm like one of the few Asian people wandering around the streets of Jonesboro. Yeah, right. And they said, "Oh, do you know Robert and Nancy?" And I go, "Who are those people?" They said, "Oh, no, we'll send you an email." So I said, "All right." So, yeah, well, actually not. I mean, Robert and Nancy are of Ethnotech, Robert Kikuchi Nangoho and Nancy Wong, down who live in San Francisco. And I said, "All right." I wrote them and said, "You don't know who I am, but these are the people who said I should contact you." And we had this little email conversation. And it turns out that they were invited by my old guild to come up and be part of a storytelling festival in the little tiny town I used to live in. So I said, fine, I'll go down there. And I met them, and I talked to them, and they were happy to be coming up to Portland. I guess they were spending some few days in Portland, then flying back to San Francisco. And so they said, "Oh, why don't you come out to dinner with us?" I said, "Okay, sure. Talk story with, storytellers. I don't know anything." And they said, "Oh, we have a mentorship program." I said, "Really?" "Yeah." And, so it's this grueling process, essays and all kinds of stuff. I had to go and fill out this form, but I did. They said, "Okay, well, why don't you come down and be our mentor? Be our mentee. We'll be your mentors." I said, "An apprentice?" "Yeah, it's an apprentice program." I said, "Okay." And so for the next year or two, I'd fly down to San Francisco like every, few months and spend long weekend there and learn the craft of storytelling. The amount of work it takes to perform at a very high level of excellence. Questions about how to run a business, the business aspect of it, and anything I was just possibly, wanted to know. And, it was really eye-opening. And like I said, that led to other things and meeting other storytellers who, again, this community is very generous and, willing to go and, talk to you, answer all of your questions. I remember one of the first storytelling festivals I'd ever been in. I didn't know. It was in Hawaii. It was a Talk Story Festival. And Margaret Reed McDonald was the feature teller. And the guy who ran it, Jeff Gear, said, "Oh, I said, I can volunteer. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, why don't you go be her driver?" I said, "Okay." And Margaret and I are good friends now.
Did you be a driver? Oh, goodness.
Well, I did. I had no idea. I was just starting out. I had no clue what I was doing. And Margaret, she's a dear friend of mine now, and she says, for the next 3 days, I peppered her with question after question after question, and she was so very patient, and answered all my questions. But I was just so hungry, so thirsty for any aspect because I had no clue what I was doing, and lots of time I still don't. But again, the patience and the accepting and taking the time to answer questions. These are things that I'm always grateful for. And, whenever asks me anything, I said, I always try to, repay that favor, saying, hey, people were very kind and generous to me when I was just starting out. It's the least I can possibly do for anyone else.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah, it is an amazing community. There are very few communities that, that I've worked in anyway, that actually act like that. Everyone's like, "Well, you'll figure it out." Just keep doing it, right? But in our community, it's like you will figure out your own way of doing it, and here are some tips to help you find that path. To go down the path and find your way, which is amazing.
Yeah, and that whole attitude, I was just kind of amazed with. Even big name tellers said, "Oh yeah, go ahead, do this," and it still happens. Like I said, I was just at this festival, Timpanogos, and Bill Harley's looking at me going, "Oh yeah. That story?" He had some questions about a story I told him. "Oh, you try it this way. You can try it that way. This is really cool. Why don't you do this?" I'm like, this is cool. This is what I miss. This is what I really, really love about this community and what I miss about not being face-to-face, sitting down and just talking to other storytellers. Yeah. I really miss that.
Yeah, and Bill's a good one to talk to too. He's amazing because
he is. He's done it all.
He has. He and Len Cabral, right? And there's a few other people in that posse. But Bill is. I love if I'm at a festival or a conference where he is, I'll kind of like, I'll shadow him at a distance.
I call it stalking.
You can call it stalking if you want. I like to call it shadowing. But it's like it's you know, to listen to him and you know, someone like Charlotte Blake Alston have a conversation. Just listen to the two of them talk about this craft and about performances and about ethics and about, you know, race, everything. You know, it's like there's no topic left unturned by Bill. You know, he just like goes in really, really deeply, which I love. So we talked a little bit about your life in Hawaii, but one of the other things that came up when I was reading up about you is these plantation stories. Now, I didn't realize that there were plantations on Hawaii, which is, you know, it's stupid really, because there are plantations everywhere. But, you know, it's so what were these plantation camps that are there or were there?
Okay, well, I can go back to the history, I suppose. The missionaries came in about, you know, Cook discovered the islands, you know, the 1770s or so, and immediately, you know, the missionaries came in about 1820 or so. Hawaiians had no written language, so one of the things the missionaries did was create a written language of Hawaiian, which was so they could, you know, spread, you know, publish the Bible in that language as well as, and the Hawaiians felt like, you know, hey, we don't have a written language. We do everything orally. Here's a written language which we can actually have our own language. So that was a great step forward. On the other hand, you know, a lot of the old ways, old traditions were pushed aside when the missionaries came in, and about you know, the Americans and English and all these people, the French, the Russians, you know, the Spanish, all these immigrants started coming into the islands, and they kept pressuring the king to go and you know. Because the king owned all the land, and everyone just kind of like, you know, were granted rights to go and use it. But the king owned everything. And these other people kept kind of telling, you know, the king, you know, you should really allow some of the land to be owned privately. And finally, in 1846, there was something called the Great Mahele, in which, people could actually own land now. And a lot of the Native Hawaiians were like the Native Americans in that they had no concept of land ownership. Right. And so when these foreigners came in and offered them money to go and buy their land, they said, oh, sure, money, we can do that here. Take the land. We don't have, and then, so I think in a matter of 30 years or something like that, by the 1870s, most of the land was owned by foreigners. And a lot of these people were the sons and daughters of the missionaries, the original missionaries who had gone into business, and they began to raise sugarcane. 1835, I think, was the first sugarcane plantation opened on the island of Kauai, I believe. And by the Civil War time, sugar prices were really high because, you know, the country was at war. And so, you know, there was all these trade agreements between the Kingdom of Hawaii and the United States. And so sugar barons, you know, ruled the roost. And then pineapple came in, was cultivated there once they were able to go and irrigate a lot of the lands from these natural aquifers. And so whaling was circling the drain by the 1870s, 1880s, and sugar was king. And they needed sugar in working in a tropical environment, high humidity, high heat, and they needed workers. It's very labor intensive. And so they needed workers. So they first brought in Chinese laborers on 5-year contracts. But it was hard work. And a lot of these Chinese, they took them after their 5-year contract was done, they went back to China, or else they left the plantations and started opening up businesses. And a lot of them, you know, didn't want to work on the plantations anymore. And so they needed another source of labor. So the Japanese started coming in about the 1868, I think was the first immigrations. And by the 1880s, there were lots of Japanese coming in. And then they went on to other, as they worked the plantations and left the plantations fulfilling their labor contracts, you know, they brought in Puerto Ricans, they brought in the Filipinos, they brought in all these different other ethnicities into the camps to be part of the labor force. The Portuguese were brought in. They were more closely, you know, of European stock, so they were made lunas or first-line supervisors. And all these ethnicities, the Koreans, the Okinawans, the Japanese, the Puerto Ricans, the Filipinos, the Portuguese, were all in separate, isolated camps. They were not allowed to mix very much because the sugar barons, they knew. Oh, go ahead.
They weren't allowed to mix?
Well, they rather have them in their own camps so that the owners could set them against each other. That way they would not organize, and they would always be fighting amongst themselves so that the owners could maintain power. Right. And so, this whole system of, and you'd buy things on credit at the company store, and at the sugar harvest, I guess there were two harvests. There was the little pay and the big pay. The little pay is halfway through, and I guess the big pay is after when the sugar is actually sold. And, but you're buying things in credit from the company store. And at the end, when you got paid, they said, okay, you owe us this much. You made this much. Okay, you still owe us this much, or here's a little bit of money left over.
Wow.
So that was kind of the whole thing. But they gave you company housing. They took care of, your needs and things like that. But again, the pay was very small because, they were saving the labor. They brought in all these ethnicities for the cheap labor. And, as a result, this plantation system perpetuated, and basically these sugar barons and pineapple barons, they basically ran the state. Even though it was a territory of the United States as of, the 1900s or so, it was run. No major decision was made except with the approval of these businessmen. And that was true pretty much up until almost statehood. And that's when, things really changed after that.
Yeah, that's amazing to think that it changed so quickly. It went from being, lands that belonged to everybody, right? Even though the king owned it, it was their land, right? To some degree. And then as soon as it started to be sold, it then does not become their land. And all of a sudden you've got these magnets of industry that were just running the place. That's fascinating stuff. That's fascinating. So you do ghost stories, and I like your ghost stories. But as I understand it, you did not like ghost stories when you were a kid. Is that right?
Oh, gosh, no. I was terrified of them. See, growing up in Hawaii, everybody had ghost stories. I mean, they knew something happened to them or something happened to a friend of theirs. And they're always, when you sit around, the thing we call a talk story. We call it gossip here. We call it talk story back home. Everyone would just sit around and they tell stories. And when they start telling ghost stories, I would plug my ears and I would walk away just because these things are so real and so scary to me. I mean, I can almost imagine these things actually happening to me because my imagination was so wild. And it wasn't until I became a storyteller that I realized, hey, I'm not hearing the ghost stories that I used to as a kid. People aren't telling them anymore. And at the time, there was a man by the name of Dr. Glenn Grant, and he collected ghost stories and the strange stories from Hawaii for over 30 years. And so I made an appointment. I talked to him, and we sat down, and he said, well, why do you want to tell ghost stories? And I sat there and thought about it. And I said, it was such an important part of my life growing up that I was scared of it, but it was always there. And now I don't hear those stories anymore. And I want to share with people that slice of Hawaii, that slice of life that I remember as a kid. And, because it doesn't exist anymore. And he kind of looked at me and said, yeah, okay, that's a good idea. And, so I started telling his ghost stories. And, that was when I was first starting out, maybe the early 90s, just as a fooling around telling story type things. He passed away in 2003. And, but I maintain a relationship, just a friendship with his business partner. And now I've been granted approval from the business partner and his estate to tell all of Glenn Grant's stories from Hawaii.
That's great.
And so, my whole point is to keep his memory and his work alive. Because, again, these stories are, at the time when I was growing up, everybody knew these stories. But now you don't hear as much.
Right.
And, he was the first person to actually go and try and publish these stories.
Have you thought about collecting them yourself? Like going to
I have
the elders?
that. Well, yeah. People tell me stories, and I, a lot of the weird stories I've heard from other people, and they've given me their permission to tell their stories, and so I'm collected a few, nowhere near, because Dr. Glenn Grant, he was called the Obake man. Obake is Japanese for ghost. And he spent his whole, like I said, 30-year career collecting stories. And he had a photographic memory. I mean, he could recall everything, so like, story I told, he would, he has a book due Monday. Okay. Friday, he sits down and starts typing. And then by Monday, he'd have a book because he just had all this stuff at the top of his mind. It's kind of amazing.
There by the grace of God go they who have those things.
Oh, yeah. And just an encyclopedic knowledge, and he was a historian, and it's just he added that extra thing. And that's what I like to do in telling the stories. I'm not interested in just the spooky stories, but why? The history behind the haunting, what possibly could be going on there, what was it like when the story occurred. These are all the little details that I really enjoy. So not just, ooh, spooky, but ooh, spooky and, here's a legend of what might be going on here. Or here's an incident that happened in that area that might be related to this haunting. That's very interesting to me. The cultural aspect, the historic aspect, and possibilities. To me, that makes a very complete story.
We'll take a break here and end this conversation, part 1 of 2 with Alton Chung. The next episode, we talk about healing with story, ghost tales, and collecting stories and story structure. Thanks for being here, and we'll be back soon.
It's just a story.